Oh, that show on Amazon Prime. I was just looking it up. That show on Amazon Prime that I was trying to think of is called The Grand Tour. So it's these same guys, uh, Jeremy Clarkson, James May, Richard Hammond, basically getting into trouble with cars, especially the episodes where they go abroad. So they call them their specials. Those are particularly great. Back on the Top Gear days, this one here is one of those where it really kind of captures what they did there. They would just come up with a premise that was funny around a way to show you a particular car. And so this is the smallest car, I believe the smallest car that was ever produced, the Peel P50. It's this ridiculous little car. And so Jeremy actually takes it to the BBC and is buzzing around the BBC offices, getting into elevators and all sorts of things in this teeny tiny little car. And he's, a fairly big fella, so it's kind of obviously British funny there as well. One other particular aspect of British television, and Americans have had their own versions of Sherlock Holmes over the years, but this is another one of those that gets updated for successive generations. Obviously, it got started in the late 1800s, bled over into the early 1900s, and since then, generation after generation have produced their own versions of Sherlock Holmes. And so, you have the classic versions, which I've linked below, but they've also had a very recent versions. This is, the show Sherlock is, arguably, I mean, I would argue it. I don't know if, how many people would go along with it, but it's some of the best television that's probably been made in the last 20 years. And there's been some great, television, that no doubt, but just the way it's produced and, the cleverness of it all, and it's just excellent television. It's really, really good. So it's, the lead in it is Benedict Cumberbatch. Martin Freeman plays, Watson, and it's just an excellent show. Especially that very first season is some fantastic television. And the interesting thing about it is that they don't really have time blocks to fill on the BBC. They can morph the schedule to suit their needs, and with Sherlock, it's each episode is essentially a movie. They're something like 90 minutes long. And so there's something that you can really enjoy and get into. And there aren't that many of them. I think they've had 3 seasons. And there's just a few episodes in each. And so it's really, really excellent. So if you get a chance, check out Sherlock. If I could recommend anything to you from any of these, I mean, depending on your likes, but that's one that just about everybody can enjoy there. And so here, I want to take just a few minutes to, kind of bring together a few ideas about, what does it mean to be British? It's one of those questions that, you can pose. Think about like your understanding of the question at the beginning of maybe a semester like this, and then think about the same question at the end. That can be one useful way to do that. And so if you think about it, a lot of times this question focuses more on the past. So if the average person is thinking about what it means to be British, they're probably thinking about what it meant to be British many, many years ago, rather than how people in Britain would see it today. But it's worth considering the past version first. So the question can focus on, what are some of the commonalities of the past. That's useful because that's often what pulls us all together when we think about a culture. It's the commonality. So if in the United States, it's often ethnic culture that pulls a certain group together and lets people feel what it is to be part of that group. So it's a lot of those commonalities. So let me pull this up. One is culture. So that's a little bit hard to define, but some common stories is one way that people can have common culture. common conflicts. So over the centuries, the people on that island have shared in certain conflicts, whether internal or external, that have sort of galvanized the people. Hardships, so going through really, really rough times, like a famine, or also wars can have the same kind of effect. Is that shared, especially the world wars, those experiences of shared hardship sort of galvanize culture around that as well. And it can be more complex than that though too, because from the outside, say to us studying modern Britain, the culture can look rather homogenous from the outside. We people all look the same, sound the same. They're all just a bunch of Brits. But to people internal, being from a couple of counties over makes you a very, very different person than the person just a little ways away. In reality, probably not that much, but to the people there, it does seem they feel quite diverse. Especially in the past, that would have been the more outside versus inside view of what culture was. Religion is a commonality. The Church of England is the state official religion there. Although and in the past it was the other religions, even other versions of Christianity, were suppressed, and so there was very much a commonality in that. It's become obviously much more pluralistic in recent years. The Industrial Revolution is one obvious one, as we spent a good bit of time here in class with that. But they were a leader in the creation of a new world, and one based on machinery and sources of power that came out of the earth and invention. All that, it became part of the DNA of the UK for many, many, many years. That became sort of part of the culture of the UK. Empire is one, especially in the 1800s when Britain was at its apex of empire. They very few experienced directly. Maybe they were part of the military or part of the governance of certain areas, but most people just appreciated it from a distance. Being part of being British was to be part of the empire, but not directly. And so but still, that was a commonality. Like the sun never set on the British Empire, and so that gives people a certain confidence about their country. You could imagine being a Roman in Rome at the apex of the Roman Empire would have had something similar. Like the world seemed to be, at the, kneeling before them in a lot of ways. And so that would have been one that was a commonality. Skin color is one. The vast majority of Britons were white up till, very, very recently. And even still today, mainly in major population centers, it's only different. But that's has been one, and it's a factor for good and ill in some ways. But it was a commonality, and what changes have been made to it that define what it is to be British today. So if you think about those, so at least a good many of those different categories, but they affect the mindset a bit differently. And so that's also somewhat interesting to look into. So culture, common stories, those are less shared. People move to the UK from all over the world, and people don't share a lot of the same attributes or heritages or past hardships or anything like that. And so there's a lot of cultural loss, if you want to put it that way, or just challenges to a common culture within the UK today in that sense. A lot of people, as far as the hardships are concerned, the vast majority of people now don't remember the World Wars, which were such a galvanizing thing for several generations of Brits. But now the World War II generation is passing, and so that changes things. Now it's just a matter of, history books and documentaries to help people realize what was shared in the past. Religion is one that is quickly changing. So the breakdown in general, about 60% Christian, 5% Islam, 1.5% Hindu, about a quarter no religion. And then of the Christians, you have something like 7 to 10% who are actually practicing, where you get a lot of people who might nod to the celebration of certain religious holidays and things like that, but aren't actually participating on a regular basis in organized religion as Christians. So that religion just doesn't play as much of a role in the society as it used to. Industrial Revolution. So for the longest period, the UK was sort of a workshop for the world. They're making just all sorts of interesting things. They, in Germany, especially in Europe, were rival powers in manufacturing. And since the about the 1970s onward, you've seen a decline over time of manufacturing happening in the UK. Now, there has been a resurgence, but a lot of times it's more small-scale manufacturing of more specialized items rather than, mass manufacturing as it would have been in the past. Somewhat similar to what the U.S. has seen, but people don't see themselves as the powerhouse of the Industrial Revolution as they used to, and empire is the same way. After the World War II era passed, you saw a breakdown of country after country leaving the British Empire and doing so generally peacefully and just choosing to be either independent or at least part of the Commonwealth, but minimally connected, much like Canada is today. But that's no longer an aspect of what it is to be British. Europe, for the past half century, Britain was part of the EU, was much closer tied to Europe, and for the longest time they would often just be at war with Europe periodically, on and off, maybe every decade or so. But then they joined the EU, and then now they've chosen to leave the EU through Brexit. So that is a currently changing way that what it is to be British. In some ways, that's a sort of a pulling back of like we've given up too much of what it is to be us by being a member of the EU, and so that's going to be interesting in the next decade or two to see how this change is affecting people's view of themselves. The who it is to be British is changing dramatically. What a person looks like who is British is changing dramatically as well. So that's over, again, in the past couple of decades, and then in decades on, it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out for the UK. And so it is really difficult to, pull together all these ideas. You almost have to talk about them each individually. I always say it's kind of like driving either a big trip across Europe or a big trip across the US, where you can't think of it all at once. You can think about the mountain states and maybe the plain states, but it's just seeing it all at once is hard. So you have to kind of define it by little pieces. But it is worth considering. What is it that makes up a British person? What is it to be British? And so there's a video here at the end that you can check out that's sort of a wrap up to the London Olympics ceremony that I think does a good job of sort of pulling a few things together, and so I hope you can enjoy that. So I think that's about all for this time. Be thinking about those big idea questions there, and I'll catch you later. All right, have a good evening.